In this tutorial, we're going to discuss how to come up with color ideas and how to develop our color studies. There's a number of different strategies that artists use to develop their color schemes, but when you're first starting out, one of the best ways to do it is to steal a color scheme from a painting that has colors that you think are appropriate to what you want to communicate in your illustration. So let's take a look at some paintings where artists are using color to communicate emotion, psychology, using color to tell a story. This is a painting by Rembrandt. The theme here is one of quiet domesticity, serenity, and you can see that Rembrandt perfectly calibrated the color scheme to fit the mood he was trying to communicate. By doing what? By muting the colors, by making the colors very soft, and by making the color scheme warm, leaning more towards yellow, towards orange, towards red. So there's a few basic principles when it comes to color. Color obviously has psychological associations. The more muted the color scheme, the softer the emotion. Generally speaking. Also generally speaking, the warmer the color scheme, the more positive the emotion. So color schemes that lean towards more red, towards yellow, have more positive associations than color schemes that will lean more towards blue, towards green. The other lesson from Rembrandt is that by limiting the palette to just a few colors, so in this case, this painting is almost monochrome, right? A few browns, a little bit of yellow, maybe a red accent here and there. By limiting the palette, it can create a very strong psychological effect, a really strong mood in the painting. Here Rembrandt shifts the color scheme a little bit towards the cooler. We're still dealing with muted color, but you can see that this color scheme is more serious. It's a little bit cooler, maybe a little bit more negative. This is Supper at Emmaus. This is where Christ is crucified, then returns from the grave and visits this poor guy at dinner. And suddenly in the middle of the meal, Emmaus recognizes that, oh my God, it's Christ returned from the dead. Much more serious theme, much more dramatic, and you can see that Rembrandt calibrated the color scheme to go a little bit cooler to reflect the seriousness of the scene being depicted. Here's another example of a very limited color scheme where the artist is using a color accent to make the color scheme feel more complete. That's an important lesson when you're muting your palette, when you're limiting your colors. It's always a good idea to have some kind of color scheme to let the viewer know that we're dealing with a full color painting as opposed to something that's entirely in monochrome. It makes the color scheme feel complete, and it could also be used to define the area of focus. So without the red, the painting would feel somewhat unfinished. We have a very limited range of color, ranging from black to a few different kinds of brown. It's really the red that makes the painting feel complete. Without it, something would be missing. Artists limit their palette in really a number of different ways. So this is a painting by Watteau. We're dealing with the Rococo period here, so probably early 18th century. Here, the artist is using a much larger variety of color, but graying everything out, muting the colors a little bit, and then pushing the color scheme towards the cool, towards blue, towards green. What impression does this give? Well, I think this is a really sad color scheme. It's somewhat depressive, right? It's on the cooler side, and it's also kind of gray, which I think reflects melancholy, sadness. The color scheme is almost fragile, kind of porcelain-like. Just one other way that artists can soften their palette, limit their range of colors for a really strong emotional effect. Now, Watteau was living during the Rococo period, where most of the colors in paintings looked a little bit like this. Artists at the time had access to a slightly larger range of pigments than artists of the Baroque era, primarily in the blues. We start seeing the use of Prussian blue in the middle of the 18th century, which cooled down the palette significantly, allowed artists to create stronger greens. So this is a painting by Boucher, The color scheme here is a little bit less serious, a little bit happier. It's on the cooler side, but through the use of these kind of really light pastels, it creates a really light-hearted, happy, happy mood. Um, all right, so conversely, this is a painting by Turner. Um, what can I say about this? Well, I think the lesson here is also the importance of limiting your color, but also that sometimes unusual color combinations, even colors that are ugly, will create a really powerful psychological effect. So Turner is employing lots of kind of ashy, bluish grays. This might push a little bit more towards purple. But he's also using kind of unpleasant colors. So these kind of mildew colors. This is maybe like 2-week-old guacamole that's been left out in the sun for a little bit. Kind of colors that are associated with nausea, with illness. Um, these are unpleasant colors, but they perfectly fit the unpleasant, somewhat dangerous mood in the painting. We have a ship that's about to sink in this storm. And the color, the unpleasant color, combined with this kind of whirling, twirling composition, creates a sense of nausea, creates a sense of chaos and disorder. And you can contrast the colors in the previous painting with this one, where Turner is borrowing from Rembrandt by warming up the color scheme, muting down the colors slightly, and creating a really warm, gentle, serene effect. So Turner is an absolute master of using color to manipulate mood. Here's a really sad painting by Turner. There's really barely anything there. This is almost an abstract painting, right? A series of brushstrokes, just really the slightest indication of detail. Again, very limited color. On the cooler side, on the muted side, this is a very, very sad, introspective, melancholy painting. Here's another painting by Turner, a very famous painting titled The Fighting Temeraire, Tugged to Her Last Berth to be Broken Up. This scene is one of nostalgia, the sadness for a long lost past, and also a social critique of the Industrial Revolution. So here we have the Fighting Temeraire, which is a sail ship that fought in the Napoleonic Wars at Trafalgar, if I'm not mistaken, had this glorious past, whose time is up and is taken by this steamship to be broken up. So the contrast between the gold and silver being used in the sail ship with these kind of ugly, horrible cockroach colors in the steamship perfectly convey the theme in the painting, as well as all these kind of rich, warm, nostalgic colors in the landscape. Here's another romantic painter, so approximately the same period as Turner. We're dealing with the early 19th century. Caspar David Friedrich, it's a German painter. Again, he's limiting his palette, so generally the palette is on the muted and the cooler side, which again conveys sadness, introspection, depression even. Let's take a look at another Caspar David Friedrich. Okay, here's another very cool painting. This might be an excellent color scheme for the cover of some kind of horror novel. Again, he's employing a limited palette here. Different kinds of blues, grays to a very powerful effect. Here are two Caspar David Friedrich paintings, the same theme, slightly different figures, but you can see how different the paintings are just in terms of the mood being conveyed by the shift in color scheme from really warm, muted, to very cool, muted. This is a painting by Francisco Goya. This is one of his earlier works that are inspired by the Rococo period, but have a certain somberness to them that is very different from the work of Boucher and Fragonard and even Watteau. Notice that Goya here is employing black. Black also has a very strong psychological connotation. It creates a sense of somberness, of even morbidity. And this is something that Goya does quite often. He'll paint some kind of lighthearted scene and through the color shift the mood towards the somber. Um, Now, this is a really important painting by Goya, the 3rd of May. Um, we still have the use of these kind of sickly colors. This is an artist who was painting around the time of Turner. They may have influenced each other. But these colors, again, have really strong psychological connotations. So the blood red against these kind of guacamole, moldy guacamole greens create a really strong psychological effect. So an important lesson with most of these paintings is that quite often simple, clean, pretty colors have less psychological emotional resonance than colors that are kind of ugly, clashing even. And sometimes a really ugly palette, ugly combination of colors create the most powerful psychological effect. Here's another Goya. This painting should have been seen before that. Here Goya is contrasting a pleasant scene with slightly unpleasant color. So we have this really fragile aristocratic lady in lace. This is a painting that probably from another artist of the Rococo period would have been depicted with lots of really pretty pastel colors. But with Goya, he employed a much more somber, unpleasant color scheme. Again, we've got these kind of slightly sickly colors on the ground, slightly acidic greens, which creates an entirely different mood. Okay, so skipping ahead quite a lot, we're moving into color that becomes less observational and more psychological. So Van Gogh is considered sort of the father of the Expressionist movement. These are artists that are more concerned with depictions of inner psychological and emotional states than depicting observed reality. Van Gogh kind of ran in between the two. So he was, to some extent, dealing with observed reality and observational color, but then occasionally pushing it in a more expressionistic direction. Here he's depicting some kind of everyday scene, a pool hall, a cafe, but through the use of color, by increasing the saturation, by creating clashing color combinations of complementary colors, he in effect is creating a hellscape. So once again, we've got these kind of nauseating greens, these kind of mildewy, sickly guacamole colors, contrasted with really strong, slightly unpleasant reds. It creates a really, really intense effect. Here Van Gogh is sort of running the line between observational and expressionistic. Notice that he's using touches of green in the face to create a sense of sickliness, number one, but also to tie the painting together. So an important lesson when using color is to always create color echoes in your work, meaning whatever color you use in one part of the composition should be echoed in other parts. So you can see that Rembrandt is using, once again, a limited palette, and that he's reusing colors. So a color that's used here is used here. A color that's used here is also in slightly different form here and here. And then we've got little touches of green accents that are used in other parts of the painting. This has the effect of unifying the composition. Because if I use one family of colors in one part of the composition and an entirely different family of colors in another composition, the composition will tend to disunify, to break apart, even if you're doing everything else to unify it, overlapping and leaning the eye and off balancing, all that kind of stuff. Color is one of the more important unifying factors in a painting. So under the influence of Cézanne, of Van Gogh, we start moving in a more expressionistic direction under the Fauvists. So these are French expressionist artists. This is an artist named André Derain, moving entirely into non-observational color. So this color scheme is more or less on the warmer side with really strong clashing greens. Recognize that once you start saturating the colors to a tremendous degree, to the point where they feel hot or glowing, it creates a really chaotic, frenzied effect. So one of sort of psychological ecstasy. What else can I say about this painting? Really beautiful. Once again, he's using a fairly limited range of color, even though the palette's much more open. Um, and it creates a sense of chaos, which is what he's looking for. Once color becomes expressionistic, once you open up the palette beyond what is possible in observational color, the range of options becomes really tremendous. So you can choose to saturate the colors to what is called the point of incandescence, where they feel like they're glowing from within. So this kind of stained glass effect that's being used by Dionne, who is a symbolist artist. So we're still dealing with the 1900s here, early 20th century, late 19th century. You have a lot of options. And usually when I'm looking for color inspiration, I turn to the post-impressionists, simply because they're doing a lot of experimentation with color. This is Edouard Monk. He's another sort of proto-expressionist. This is a scene of a deathbed, of sickness, and you can see that Munch is perfectly calibrating his sickly greens to communicate the emotion that he wants out of this painting. Under the influence of the Fauves and Munch, we have the German Expressionist movement. This is Ludwig Kerchner. What can I say about this painting? Well, really unusual color combinations. Again, kind of using slightly ugly colors, colors that really push the saturation. Again, lots of sickly greens to emphasize the sense of nausea and unease. And quite often employing really ugly color schemes that are incredibly unpleasant. So this combination of mildewy, yucky greens with ashy grays, with these kind of dirty pinks, creates a really unpleasant effect, which is really, really, really powerful, because this painting is much about social isolation. It's about, well, the aggressiveness of these women, with all these sharp corners. He was trying to get an unpleasant effect, and through obviously the composition, the way the brushstrokes are applied, but mostly the color scheme, he's able to achieve it. This is Max Beckmann. What can I say about this? Well, like a really unpleasant painting, right? One of tremendous violence. In this case, he's choosing to mute the color scheme, and it's a little bit on the warmer side, but he's also using lots of black to make the color scheme very somber, and these really hot, aggressive, really saturated reds, which shock you, which create a really sort of shocking, unpleasant effect. Here is George Gross, another German expressionist, another really sort of jarring, slightly unpleasant color scheme. Scene of chaos, death, mayhem. But the German expressionists, this expressionist movement didn't always use unpleasant color. So this is Dionne, using really saturated colors, really complicated colors. Another limited palette, though, that can be really, really effective. This is Franz Marc. So this is the Blue Rider movement that included Kandinsky, the first pure abstract painters. Again, once you start moving in an abstract, expressionistic direction, color no longer has to be observational. It can be whatever you want. So you can choose to make all the colors really saturated. Just think about what you're trying to convey psychologically, what kind of storytelling you're trying to employ through your color scheme, and choose a color scheme that you think might be appropriate. Lots of other ways, however, of developing your color ideas. If your painting needs to evoke a certain time period, you can look at photographs of the time period and choose colors that are associated with it. So this is a photograph probably from the late 60s, early 70s, and these colors were quite common in the period. So growing up, I had lots of avocado green in my carpets. Our shag carpeting was horrible. It had a combination of avocado green and this kind of burnt orange. It was absolutely horrific. So these colors are kind of associated with the design of the time period, and if you use them, you have a good chance of evoking that particular time period in your illustration. This is a photo taken in the 50s. These kind of turquoise blues in combination with these colors are very common in the time period. Up, there's another George Grosz. Psychedelic colors. And this is clearly speaks of the 60s. So you can use color schemes that were popular during the whatever time period you want to depict and work that way. Okay, so here are examples of color studies. These were probably done in Photoshop, quite possibly. But here we have a range of options, which is really important when you're doing color studies. Give yourself a range. So don't do two color studies that are the same, where colors are just switched around. So here we're using a warmer, more saturated color scheme. Here we're using a color scheme that is slightly cooler and slightly more muted. Right? So that's one way of developing color ideas. Do one that's more saturated, do one that's less saturated. You can switch colors around. So these two are almost reverse of each other. Here, really warm color scheme with lots of yellows with little blue accents, or the reverse, a color scheme with lots and lots of cool, lots and lots of blue with a few yellow accents. You can see that these two create a very, very different mood. This is some kind of happy story, and this is some kind of dystopia, right? Another way of developing color ideas is to think about what time of day the illustration is happening in. So here we have exactly the same illustration with three different times of day. Early morning, late afternoon, and this is late at night. Another way of developing color ideas. This I'm showing you because these three color studies fail to some extent. The colors are different, but the mood being created in them is almost entirely the same. So in this case, the artist is switching around the colors a little bit, but because the colors are mostly on the cooler side and about the same degree of saturation all the way through, in terms of emotional effect, they're the same. Again, when you're doing color studies, you want to give yourself a range of options so that you can go one direction or another. If you make them the same, you limit yourself. You limit the range of options. You can't really make a decision. All right. Now, color studies do not have to be detailed. These are obviously not done in watercolor or acrylic. These are done with color pencil, probably. I would say that these two color studies are probably a little too close to each other, but these two represent two very, very different options. A very limited color scheme, a more varied color scheme that leans more towards saturated. Notice that in this case, the artist is simplifying the image. I'm assuming that the original, which I don't have, is probably a lot more detailed. He's reducing things to blobs of light and dark, simplifying the drawing tremendously, but not simplifying the color. So the artist here is really dealing with the variety of color and the color transition from here to here, from the darker skin tone to the lighter skin tone. So when you're doing color studies, keep the color complicated, but keep the drawing very, very simple. Reduce things down to blobs. So in the next part of the video, I'm going to show you guys how to actually do the color studies. I'm going to choose a couple of the paintings that I've showed you and steal the color schemes and create my studies.